Okay, so I'm going to talk about virtue today, specifically virtue in relation to the middle way. And I'm going to share a PowerPoint. I hope you'll be able to see. So the next, these next three sessions, we'll be looking at three different ethical approaches. So if anyone's done a bit of ethics at any point, you're maybe familiar with these, or if you're not, it doesn't matter. But basically, there are three traditional ways of thinking about ethics. So they're known as virtue ethics, consequentialism, and what you might call the ethics of principle or deontology. So we're going to look at those in turn, and the middle way, I think, can offer a distinctive approach to all of them. So just very briefly to run through them. So virtue ethics is thinking about ethics, thinking about what's good in terms of our overall characters, developing a good character, if you like, habitual good character. Consequentialism is thinking of good as making decisions that bring about good consequences. And the ethics of principle is thinking of what's good in terms of obeying certain principles, following certain principles that tell you what's good. So my overall case is going to be all of these do have something to be said for them. So it's not obvious to me that one of them is superior to the others, which may surprise you if you intuitively think one of them is better than the others. So my case is going to be that they all have a role in thinking about the middle way and the best way of judging things. So I'm going to start this week with virtue ethics as one of those. But basically, the approach with all of them, including virtue ethics, is looking for stretch. So this diagram, which I think Jim sent to me a while ago, is quite useful, I think, for thinking about the idea of stretch. So we have a kind of comfort zone of things we're familiar with, ways of behaving, ways of thinking and judging things that are not particularly challenging. We do habitually. But of course, we could also be overstretched and get into the panic zone, which probably won't help us. It'll just stress us too much to be able to sustain that way of operating. But the stretch zone, somewhere in between, is more of the sweet spot or the middle way in terms of developing ourselves morally. So allowing moral demands to stretch us in ways that help us to develop. So that obviously applies to thinking about virtue as it does to other ways of thinking about ethics. Okay, so stretch and not overstretch will be one way of thinking about it. Now, yeah, the idea of virtue, I put this picture on the web page on the website just to illustrate virtue. It's a Renaissance depiction of the idea of virtue, but it just shows you some of the kinds of perhaps tensions in which we develop virtue. But virtue basically means good qualities, good moral qualities, habitual qualities, such as we might develop, and they're the opposite to vices. Vices are bad moral qualities, traditionally speaking. And that picture so shows in some symbolic ways the circumstances in which we develop virtue was kind of stretched between the demands of time on the one hand and death next to the person's left hand, and then perhaps the flowers represent beauty or something like that in the right hand, and then the idea of wisdom, I think, is symbolized by that the snake eating its own tail above her head. Virtue involves positive qualities, which you might instinctively feel involves the middle way, because we've got to find some sort of balance in those qualities. And virtue ethics is the belief that what's good is developing those positive moral qualities. And that means that it's focused on how you are habitually, so your character, rather than on specific judgments. Now that can be a bit problematic, because some forms of virtue ethics almost take the view that you don't have to worry about specific judgments, because if you're virtuous enough, then you won't, you'll always make the right decisions. Of course, I think that's a bit of a big assumption. However virtuous we are, we're still going to have to make decisions, and we won't be automatically able to make the right decisions, as it were. But it's certainly easier, one would have thought, if you've got into the right sorts of habits, then it's easier to make the right judgments on the spot. And sometimes some kind of training is obviously crucial. If you think of the training given to a surgeon, for example, to make an on-the-spot snap decision that saves somebody's life, that's obviously an extreme example, but that comes from habit. Without that habitual training, the surgeon won't be able to do that. The ancient thinker Aristotle talked in terms of practical wisdom as being the key idea of the ability to make good, balanced decisions as a virtue. But virtue seems to begin really with our infancy and our socialization. So if you think of, I love this picture. It's in the Barber Institute in Birmingham. So it's just as a somewhat idealized but really lovely picture of family life. Anyway, but yeah, so you can take that as depicting the early process of socialization, as we often call it these days. So as we're brought up as children, we develop certain virtues that our society imbues into us to a greater or lesser extent. So we learn, for example, not to be violent to other people. We learn economic reciprocity. So if you go into a shop and you buy something, then they give you the goods and you give them the money, and so you don't just take the goods and don't give them the money. So most of the time, it wouldn't occur to us to act in any other way than that. It's become just habitual, part of our character, as do things like politeness, sorts of perhaps more optional things. So social virtues, basic social virtues, are very grounded and embodied in how we operate. And there are certain standards there involved as well, which are socially recognized. So you can do them better or worse. But how we go on to develop from there depends perhaps on what sorts of ways we choose to develop our skills and talents and moral direction. So here I think the ideas of Alistair MacIntyre are quite interesting and useful. So Alistair MacIntyre is a philosopher who wrote a book that came out in 1981 called After Virtue. And at the time, people weren't thinking very much in terms of virtue ethics. So it was a new kind of launch of the idea of virtue ethics, from which had previously been discussed by people like Aristotle in ancient Greece. And MacIntyre's particular take on virtue is interesting, because he really goes into what it means to develop virtues in our social settings. And he talked about goods within a practice. So he thought that we develop not just good in general, but specific sorts of good in the specific situation of what he called a practice. So an example of a practice might be football. So it's a socially recognized activity, and the crucial thing is that it includes socially recognized standards of excellence. So you can be a better footballer or a worse footballer, and you have to work at becoming a better footballer. And that's really what distinguishes any kind of practice, as he called it. So you could do the same thing with knitting or agriculture or being a sociology lecturer, so all kinds of professions all kinds of crafts, and, sports and so on, could be regarded as practices. So if we think about the example of football, obviously when people train in football to become better footballers, they'll develop basic things like fitness and agility and so on, but also there are aspects of this which you might regard as much more moral. So things like awareness of others in your team, or awareness of others in the other team, concentration, adapting yourself to the discipline of the rules of the game. So you put yourself in that space where you have to develop in certain ways and stretch yourself, and it gives you the opportunity to do that. So there's a lot to be said, I think, for practices, and I think that tells us something about practice in a broader sense. That when we practice, we put ourselves in a particular sort of framework, which is in some way socially recognized, where we develop in a specific sort of way. So if you think of yourself going on retreat, for example, is a bit like this. So you put yourself in a certain space where there are certain social expectations, and they enable you to develop in a particular way that may challenge you, but not overstretch you, not overstress you. So that's perhaps one of the major elements of how, practically speaking, we can develop virtue. It involves socially recognized goods within practices. But of course, the possible drawback or limitation, let's say, with these kind of social virtues in practices is that they can conflict with each other. So if you think about different groups that may confront each other at different times, they may have very different views about what desirable virtues are. The example of the police or the army, for example, with what might be called martial virtues, contrast with the peaceful virtues that you might get in a group like, say, Extinction Rebellion or Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament in the past. There are different groups with very different emphasis about what makes a good person, what are good habits of a person. And there's even more marked differences between traditional and modern societies when it comes particularly to things like the role of women, and what makes a good woman in a traditional society is very different from what makes a good modern woman. Very different attitudes to animals and children and so on. So there's lots of different contrasts and possible conflicts in virtues. So what may make a good nun doesn't necessarily make a good member of a drug gang, etc. So how do we get over these conflicts? Well, the traditional solution to this is what you might call absolute virtues. So we have beliefs about what are the right virtues to develop, which are deduced from some sort of metaphysical belief, some absolute belief, which perhaps have been given by God or some religious tradition, whatever. So some examples of that. St. Thomas Aquinas, writing in the 12th century, tried to bring together the virtues from the classical times with Christian virtues. So the ones listed in blue there, prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance, are what he called the natural virtues. So ways we can develop that were recognized in classical age and don't depend on a specific religious approach. But he also then added the 3 Christian virtues, which come from St. Paul: faith, hope, and charity. So he thought those were the divine virtues bestowed by God. So that's a kind of classic Christian list of, I mean, there are other lists, but of what was considered the virtues to cultivate for a Christian. And some of those we may be able to relate to. So prudence, is looking ahead and avoiding dangers and difficulties and so on, keeping something in your bank account, taking out insurance, justice, being fair to others, whether it's paying the shopkeeper or dividing the cake evenly or whatever. Fortitude is being able to plod on across the moor in the rain. Temperance, keeping your desires within a bigger context, best, yes. So you're not driven by your obsessions without any control over them. So we can learn a lot from these. There can be inspirations, perhaps, but they're in a framework which is absolute. So the way that they were justified took us back to absolute claims. You could say similar things with some differences as well from the Buddhist approach. So the Buddhist Eightfold Path, I think, gives us 8 virtues. If you developed right view, the second one in this diagram says right intention, I would say right aspiration is a better translation, but things like right view, right aspiration, right speech, right action, right livelihood, etc. They're all ways we could become better through habitual development, and they all interlock with each other in the way the Eightfold Path does. So there's a very I think helpful structure there of ways we can develop virtues. But obviously it's a long discussion to talk about the Eightfold Path. There's a discussion in my book, The Buddha's Middle Way, if you want more details on that middle way approach to it. But yeah, the possible drawbacks with these ways of thinking about virtues is that they are at least traditionally tied to absolute perspectives and justified through those perspectives. So what's a middle way approach to this, which isn't just deriving the virtues from an absolute source, nor just saying this is what we get from our group, from our society? Well, I would say it's begins with our socialized virtue, our practices, which provide a starting point, but where there's conflict between socialized virtues, then integration is a crucial thing. The absolute virtues, particularly things like the Eightfold Path, can help us with integration in the sense that they can provide us with ideas about the kinds of virtues we can develop. They can challenge us, as long as we don't take them absolutely and feel that we have to suddenly become, have a totally right view, or be totally mindful, for example, or be totally temperate, or whatever it is. So, for example, thinking back to Aquinas' list, temperance helps you see your desires in perspective. That's of obvious value, isn't it? That you're not too tied to addictions, for example. Temperance is generally the virtue that might help you avoid slipping into addictions of one kind or another, and that's aided by mindfulness. So if you fitted together the idea of a virtue like temperance and try to support that for a practice like mindfulness, then you might be able to develop it in a more sustainable way. Or if you think about the Christian virtue of hope, so we all need some hope, and that might start with our kind of default optimism. I think that Ian McGilchrist comments that our default setting really is kind of shallow optimism, that the left hemisphere dominance means that we tend to be generally optimistic. But if we're going to ground that hope well, make it more realistic, then we need to combine it with wisdom. So other virtues need to be integrated with hope rather than just having shallow hope, absolutized hope. Okay. So yeah, the integration of the virtues will start with the qualities we actually have and use practice to make each of those virtues more effective in the context of the whole path. So we need to have an idea of the whole path, what it demands of us, but also a realistic development from where we start. And that's why it might be helpful to think in terms of, well, what virtues do I actually have? And would it help me to develop maybe the opposite type of virtue? So sometimes virtues appear contradictory, like courage and patience, for example, or prudence and generosity. So a model of the whole path helps us balance those virtues and not integrate them. And the energy we might put into developing virtues in general, is focused on practice in the broadest sense, but we might also need to balance that with other moral priorities. So in the next couple of sessions, I'll be talking more about other possible moral priorities. So if we're acting in response to global warming, for example, do we go all out for acting in a way that will try and deal with that situation, or do we focus on developing the virtues that might help us develop with that situation better? I don't think there's an easy answer to that. We need both. We need the virtues and we need the action. So we need to be able to integrate that in one way or another. The key thing is to be aware of both of those priorities rather than just adopting one unreflectively. Okay, so I think that's all I've got to say. Let's open for questions. So any thoughts about any of that?
What would you say, Robert, to the thing about the professional football, in a sense, seems a bit of an odd choice in that it's totally corrupt, and there's a whole culture out there of cheating and diving in the penalty area, and the idea that if one player said, well, I didn't claim that penalty because it's not the right thing to have done because I wasn't actually fouled, they'd just laugh him out of the changing room, wouldn't they? So it's the idea that it's I don't know what. Maybe I'm missing something there. I just thought that seemed a bit of an odd choice.
Interesting. Well, perhaps you followed football a lot more closely than I do if you're very aware of its corruption. But wouldn't you say that people also develop virtues through football?
I think I would say probably the enduring thing about it is really hypocrisy, I think, in that to be honest, I will accept, I don't really follow it. I don't know much. I mean, I know a bit more than I should because my son watches it and kind of says, oh, come on, Dad, watch United, sort of, a bit. But I think it's the kind of hypocrisy where the kind of cheating is endemic, and they will, if they can, get a penalty by foul means in the other box, then that's exactly what they will do. They'll take a dive. And if it happened in the other box, then exactly the same set of circumstances. If a penalty was given to the other side, they'd all be jumping up and down. And it's this kind of lack of rationality in a sense that, I mean, I understand the emotions behind it, but it's this kind of idea of there's no virtue in it, in the sense that, if you probably said to an individual footballer or football fan, well, sort of, isn't it really a bad thing when you get a player showing some dazzling skill and then he just gets hacked down because the other player, he's got past a player? They'll probably all agree in principle that's the wrong thing, it shouldn't be like that. But then they will just say, but that's the way it is, and it's silly and naive to think otherwise. So the kind of enduring thing to me really is that that's why I don't particularly bother with it, is because it's frustrating to see just this kind of constant cheating all the time, really, with it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, and this is going to apply to any practice, isn't it? It's going to be imperfect in one way or another. But I mean, I was thinking more of playing football, developing through football, perhaps as a teenager or whatever. Isn't there quite a big difference between a group of teenage lads playing football and developing by doing that, and what goes on in the Premier League or whatever, which has a lot, obviously, big commercial aspect to it and a lot of difficulties. But yeah, you can also think of very corrupt examples like there's the proverbial honor among thieves, or even in a gang of drug smugglers or something. Yeah, so there are some virtues you can develop by being part of that group, but there may also be a lot of vices, and obviously you'd have to take that one by one. But the key idea here is just that, however imperfect the group, you can develop some virtues through it, and then you have to think about the conflicts between that group and other groups. So the vices, you may have picked up some virtues in football, for example, along with some vices, and then you might become aware of the vices by coming into contact with another group, which is different from the footballers. So at least it's a realistic way of thinking about how people actually develop, rather than just an idealized way of thinking.
It's probably where outside pressures come, isn't it? I guess in things like if you have a culture within a group and things that they aspire to, but it's when outside pressures may come into it. So like football, of course, is the idea of, well, it's all very well you being virtuous, but if we lose the game, then there's, we get knocked out of the Champions League or whatever, and there's a lot of money to be lost. And I think with the criminal example is that the idea of honour amongst thieves, but if one criminal thinks actually, well, okay, I could do the honourable thing here and not grass on my mates, but I'm going to get 20 years inside of a do, so maybe that kind of virtues wear a little bit thin at that point, and they will do something different,
Yeah. So, but in no case, I really don't want to idealise any context where people develop these virtues, because they may be very, very rough contexts indeed in some places.
Yeah.
Any other comments or thoughts from anyone? Vijay.
Yeah, I thought it was quite interesting, maybe helpful to have an example that wasn't, we often think of virtues as something lofty or pious. So it was quite interesting, I thought, to have the football example. But it did serve the purpose of offering a frame of structure where young people can stretch themselves and they have to learn the rules and so on. I imagine that's what you were getting at, and that good players have to be virtuous to some extent. They have to learn the rules and have to learn how to be fair and have to learn how to play as a team. So I found that quite an interesting approach. One thing I noticed, though, the word values, I might have missed it, but it didn't seem to appear anywhere. And I was wondering if that was a way of structuring or trying to work around these conflicting virtues of different groups. You talked about absolute belief, but I was wondering if it's the idea of shared values of communities and societies that can somehow try and work these things out.
Yeah, well, there are shared values in the practices that McIntyre talked about. So that's one of the features of them. So with football, for example, there are shared values that help to develop virtues, according to McIntyre. Like the value of teamwork, for example, in that context. But of course, those values may also have their limitations. So yeah, using the word values would just be another way of talking about the same thing. I guess I talked about ethics or social virtues.
Yes, you talked about values quite a lot in different contexts, but I was just wondering about its absence, it seemed to me, in this context.
Yeah, I mean, I like to think in terms of a continuity between desires and values, so that we're not absolutizing values, but values are just kind of refinements of desire, if you like, exercisations of desire. Any other thoughts or questions?
I'll say something.
Yeah, Bridget?
I was really interested in the idea that I always want to contextualize. So the idea that one cannot exist without the other. So that to compete is also that you compete against, but you work with. And to me, there's a sort of it's nearly like a progressional stage of things that you described as, the practice. You practice working with a team. And then there was a really lovely example in cricket, actually, and I'm not a big sports person, but my husband is, and they were playing, I think, the West Indies and a month or two back, and that cricketers so deeply congratulated each other when they did some good runs or bowling, and it was so genuine. And to me, that was holding that tension of being the ethic and the you cannot separate this tension in the middle way, that when we absolutize and as you described, idealize, that really was helpful, Robert, for me, is that to contextualize it, that the two have to go together. Nearly the opposites, the left right brain or whatever we call it, actually has to be integrated into the one. And when we compete at all costs, like in a war, there's something of, or when anything like any, even Extinction Rebellion, when it becomes obsessive about one thing over another, and because there are no flights and now there are no this or that, we actually all starve to death because we haven't got an economy that can sustain enough food production to have a totally green world. It creates the opposite. It's that balance that I found really helpful.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of competition, obviously a lot of the limitation of a lot of the practices one could talk about, particularly sports, is that they're competitive. But in a way, to have those limited loyalties, we need that as a staging post, I think, to wider loyalties. And that's one of the difficulties, isn't it? We can jump to sort of premature identification with the whole world, whilst perhaps overleaping the intermediate stages, as it were, of the virtues that go with the group.
You idealize it, so it's the child, the teenager, who says, moralizes with their parents, we've got to share more with the world, we've got to share. And then the sister takes her ruler. That's mine! Don't you dare touch it.
Great example, yes.
And it's just so common, isn't it, among all of us? We're all so generous until we're threatened.
Yeah. Okay. Any other perhaps final question or point? Mark.
Along these lines, I've been reading a book by Scott Atran, not too recent, it's about 10 years old, Talking to the Enemy, about his research as an anthropologist, interviewing terrorists, especially in Palestine. And he makes the point that we need to understand them, their motivations and their sense of honor and revenge and courage, and how much joy and pleasure that the population there gets when there's news of a suicide bombing somewhere in their cause. And I'm wondering how virtue ethics would deal with people who, especially, a majority of a population, ethnic group who feel so strongly as the underdogs and the oppressed, that they see virtue in killing or martyrdom, as they call it, sacrificing one of their young people for their cause in killing others, innocent people. So do we just say, well, they're wrong, it's not virtuous? Or do we understand it through their view and try to look at their motivations and the larger historical and social reasons around that for a kind of middle way understanding of the paradox of their virtue?
I mean, in a way, you can't condemn acts on grounds of virtue. So it's virtues are about habits, and attitudes and so on. So you could have people with attitudes and habits that have virtuous elements that could be developed, and yet you can think some of their actions are wrong. So like suicide bombings, but they may be motivated by, for example, a sense of justice. So you could, justice is one of those virtues mentioned by Aquinas that I talked about, and that goes back to Aristotle. So everybody has a sense of justice, and so then the question, well, do you absolutize that sense of justice and think, well, your particular idea about the way in which this particular issue should be dealt with justly must be absolutely correct, and we're not listening to any other views, or in which case you might end up with violence, or are we going to work with that sense of justice and incorporate new insights into it? So that will be the way I'd suggest that we could try and build on virtues that people already have, and stretch them, whatever situation they start in, even if it's a very group dependent kind of perspective. There will be virtues within that group that they've been socialized into that could then be stretched. I mean, it's obviously not at all easy in many cases, but I think there is a potential way forward. Okay, well, perhaps we better pause there. So I will stop the recording.